set of problems. Maybe gesture a bit to what's in the paper. If you haven't read it, the paper takes as its object of study the field of education. We're interested in the relationship between algorithmic management, which I'll tell you about in a second, how we define it, and professional expertise in the broadest sense. So now, I should be able to hit a button here and make this go down, only this one. How do I make no, that one we should not have hit. I just tried the, on the, okay, here. Let me move this over here, because I thought the,
It's so finicky.
yeah, it's really.
I'm so sorry. So I think left and right will get you.
Okay, left and right. Very good.
Yeah.
All right, we're good. Okay, so we want to study the contending knowledge claims of algorithmic management and professional expertise. So the way the paper is going to work, if you haven't read it, is it takes the form of a stylized debate between a learning engineer and, let's say, a teacher. And each of them is making different kinds of claims. We don't adjudicate those claims. We do not do a second order narration above them and say, yes, but. We leave this to our protagonists, our antagonists, if you like. That's the way the paper works. It's an unconventional style. It seems casual. It's not. So let's give some background. Why do we use the term algorithmic management? And we do that deliberately because we're interested in the similarities and the differences between scientific management at the turn of the 20th century and algorithmic management at the turn of the 21st century. So when I say we're interested in the similarities and differences, that sort of gets us started, but it's not the end point. We're not historians. We're not going to retell the history of the early 20th century in light of new events now. We're not going to talk about the history. We are interested in how it is that there is a new form of what we're going to call intra-class conflict between different segments of a knowledge class that first came into existence in the period of the first part of the 20th century. So to be very clear, we do not see algorithmic management as some inheritor or fuller realization of scientific management. There's a lot of people who write about digital Taylorism, scientific management, I don't know, 5.6 or whatever they want to call it. This is now, Taylor had a vision and it's finally able to be realized. We think that seeing out the machine learning and its impact in society in terms of a continuation of bureaucratic, say, control, bureaucratic supervision by other means is not the right way to understand what's going on in the world today. So first, Taylorism, actually now in retrospect, we can we can see it as being more algorithmic than, probably people who wrote, my first published article was in Theory and Society a long, long time ago. It was a critique of Braverman. I never used the word algorithms and taught the subject of scientific management for decades, never used it. But in retrospect, we could go back and look and see what they were doing. This whole idea that you would have step-by-step protocols for the one best way does seem very algorithmic, and that's doubtless. But we think it would be a mistake now to say that algorithmic, the new form, is just now new form of Taylorism. For this reason, or for several, say starting with this one, is that whereas scientific management sees humans as programmable, algorithmic management sees machines as capable of learning. It's not just now we can see humans as being even more programmable or simply substitutable, but that algorithmic management is based on some idea that machines are capable of learning, whereas scientific management was about seeing humans as programmable. Say a little bit more about this comparison contrast. So at the turn of the 20th century, there was a new knowledge class, and it was spearheaded by the mechanical engineers. Taylor was a mechanical engineer. The Association of Mechanical Engineers was the key kind of institutional organization in the movement of the early scientific managers. And we want to claim that they were the sort of forefront of a new class that claimed that it had legitimate share of some part of the social surplus. It could justify its salaries, not on the basis that it owned and not on the basis that it labored, but on a different basis, which was that it knew better. So there was an intense class conflict that was going on at the turn of the 20th century, and it was very much between capital and labor. But if you analyze scientific management only in terms of those class dichotomies, you're going to miss another process that's going on, which is there's a new group that is in between both capital and labor and has different principles of legitimation here, that it knew better. What do we find in the 21st century? Again, engineers at the forefront of this movement. They're not mechanical engineers, they're software engineers. They're championing algorithmic management. And on that basis, they are a segment of this same knowledge class, but which is challenging professional expertise. That's the question that we're asking. We know that there is a challenge, and we're wondering in different fields, and education is the one we're going to start looking at, when that will be resulting in a sort of head-to-head conflict, when a compromise, when are those parties moving more so? So what do we mean by this problem of the difference between algorithmic management, which we could say AI management, we could say machine learning management, algorithmic management is the one of choice here, is that the professional managerial, this old new knowledge class, claims that it has expertise in a specific field. Expertise is expertise in a specific field. There's nothing like expertise that's across all fields. It's always within a field. That is, it's contextually localized knowledge. The algorithmic manager claims are that it is a specialized knowledge. It is software engineering. It is a specialized knowledge. But they are saying that it is not field specific. Software code is software code in any field. We have the skills, we have the ability, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, the devices, the programs, the models that are applicable anywhere. So the problem of the professional expertise from the point of view of the algorithmic manager is, okay, they exercise that the professionals say, you know, we exercise judgment. We don't just have a set of codified rules, we exercise judgment. The algorithmic managers come back and say, we know what judgment is. That's just another word for bias. You're entangled by these messy values. You bring in the sort of background. Again, we're not adjudicating these claims. We're simply interested in articulating them. The professional expertise must offer an explanation. The algorithmic manager may be called upon to make an explanation, but frequently they say, we don't know. I don't know. I can't explain it to you. So we're entering in this period, and we wonder, so you may wonder, well, why do we use this language of class conflict, when so obviously this is just a case of competing professional jurisdictions, of which there's plenty of literature in sociology. For example, in the field of education or of law or medicine or psychotherapy, or you read them on and on and on. The problem is that algorithmic management is confronting professional expertise in all of those fields and many more. So we cast the problem in terms of class, signaling that the process is societal and not field specific. There are other reasons why it is not simply a case of one set of professionals finding some kind of cohabitation with another group of professionals. It is not a struggle about professional jurisdiction. And here's the reason. So there are professions, of course, like accounting, like management, like law, that cohabitate with other professionals. So we get, scientists with managers, architects with lawyers, doctors with accountants, and so on. Algorithmic management is different because it is not simply a different way of managing the activities of professionals. Instead, it claims a different way of carrying out the activities themselves. Not only have managers and professionals, the algorithmic manager says, we can do it. In fact, we can do it better and we can do it differently. And in the process, they are reconfiguring the contours and characters of those functions themselves. I think that shows you that kind of outline structure of our paper. And with 30 seconds left, we're done.
Thank you so much. I would now like to introduce Lauren Chambers, who will be speaking on behalf of, I believe also in the room is Amina and Abigail, on their paper, The Limits of Algorithmic Transparency, Lessons Learned from the U.S. Census Implementation of Differential Privacy.
Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me now? Yes. Oh, I hear myself echoing. I hate that. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for sticking around for this last session. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. My name is Lauren. I'm here to share today some early work with a collaboration with Amina and Abby, as well as my advisor, Deirdre Mulligan at the Berkeley School of Information. So while I'm speaking, please know that this is very much shared work, and I'm excited to be the one sharing it with you today. So to jump right in, we're looking at how the U.S. Census Bureau has adopted differential privacy in the past few years. So for those who aren't particularly familiar, the U.S. Census Bureau is an agency under the Department of Commerce that attempts to count every U.S. resident every 10 years. And the output of this census data is used for a lot of different purposes, from deciding how many representatives different states get in the House, to allocating federal funding and informing demographic research, among other things. Relevant for this work is the fact that the U.S. Code Title 13 requires that the Bureau keeps census data confidential. Now, this confidentiality is a bit of a problem, and over the course of the decades, the Bureau has adopted different sorts of mechanisms in what it calls its disclosure avoidance system, which is kind of a silly term, but we call it the DAS, which ranges from simply not posting census data publicly, which it did in the early 1800s and then stopped doing, to suppressing specific tables or specific metrics. And then in more recent years, things like swapping individual records or imputing data, or even rounding or top coding, which is where if you have a value that's particularly high, an outlier, it's just reported as some maximum, arbitrary maximum. All of these things trying to maintain the confidentiality of the people within the census. In more recent years, there has been kind of a new threat to the confidentiality of census data in the form of what is called reconstruction experiments, which is when an adversarial actor can re-identify an individual within a database using advanced computational methods, as well as other data sources that might be available now on the internet. And because of their federally mandated requirement to keep census data private, the Bureau has been really concerned about these sorts of experiments. And so they announced in 2018 that they would be adopting what's called differential privacy in the 2020 census. Differential privacy is a formal mathematical definition of privacy that was defined by theoretical computer scientists in 2006. There's a lot of different metaphors out there to describe it because it's a little complicated, but the one that I think is most relevant for today is that differential privacy involves the intentional addition of noise to a data set in order to prevent the re-identification of any given individual within the data set. So you can see here, you could add a little bit of noise to the data set and really maintain kind of the original, stay genuine and kind of high fidelity to the original data, or you could add a lot of noise to the data set and have something almost unrecognizable but extremely private. And that is encoded in differential privacy in this parameter called epsilon. So a high value of epsilon reflects high accuracy but low privacy protections, while a low value of epsilon reflects lots of privacy, but also perhaps a lot of loss in accuracy. And the authors of differential privacy themselves, way back in 2006, made very clear that the choice of epsilon is not dictated by differential privacy as a theory, but rather is chosen by policy. After the Bureau announced that they would be using this new method, they got a lot of attention, partially because of this policy choice in epsilon, but partially because of a lot of other things that were floating around in the air around the census in 2018, 2019, 2020, and since. And so it's become quite the site of controversy and also a site of study for social scientists who are interested in questions of statistics and computer science and algorithms, all being used in very public governance, public policy settings. And so we're hoping to expand upon that work with a specific focus on how the Bureau engaged with various publics as they were implementing differential privacy in their disclosure avoidance system and the effects of those engagements. And then hoping that that case study, this is a case study, might teach us more broadly about how to successfully engage publics in algorithmic governance. And so in our paper, if you had the chance to read it, you'll see that we are thinking also with a couple different theoretical lenses. Namely boundary objects, which is a theory posited by Susan Lee Starr and James Graysomer in 1989 that talks about sorts of objects that allow disparate groups to work together across boundaries without necessarily having consensus, and objects that have interpretive flexibility that might be weakly structured in general across different domains, but strongly structured in specific contexts. And also perhaps more modern theoretical lens of the handoff model, which was developed by Deirdre Mulligan and Helen Nissenbaum in 2020, which is a way of identifying and characterizing what changes when responsibility becomes delegated to technical actors in systems. So the handoff model lists 5 different kind of places to look in a system to expose how values might be changing when you bring new technical actors into it. So that includes the components of the system, the functions of the system, how the components act on or engage with one another, the modes that are employed by those components, and the trigger that caused the change. I think it's fair to say that we're still trying to figure out exactly how these theoretical lenses plug into this particular case study. So we are very open to and appreciative of any feedback you might have about the utility and kind of fitting inness of these lenses. And of course, we're building on a lot of related work from such great scholars, including Dana Boyd, J.C. Shrathi, Dan Broeck, Priyanka Nanayakara, and Jessica Holman, who've all done really great work looking at the social and political implications of differential privacy in the census. But moving on, so starting out, what exactly did the Bureau do to support public input? And the short answer is a lot. The slightly longer answer includes there was a lot of direct communication and artifacts that they published, from blogs written by the chief scientist to GitHub repositories with the literal code for the differentially private algorithm that they would use, and also demonstration data, which is where they applied the new differentially private algorithm to data from 2010 so that interested parties could compare the 2010 original data to this new differentially private 2010 data and see what would change. There's also a lot of effort put into educating stakeholders with YouTube videos and webinars and handbooks written for lay audiences that did not assume theoretical computer science expertise. There was a lot of direct solicitation of public input, including on the Federal Register. They held a 2-day workshop with the national academies where they invited data users to come tell them about how they use census data and what their concerns and priorities would be around what differential privacy might do. And they also had direct consultations with tribal leaders as one particular group that is affected by the output of census data. And finally, they also solicited external evaluations from groups such as JASON, which is kind of a mysterious governmental advisory group, and also external committees that live kind of within the Census Bureau. And then the more analytic question is, what are the effects of all of these efforts that they put in? And there's also a lot. So when it comes to process, we see how the Bureau changed from more static modes of engaging with the public to more dynamic modes. So interactive consultations and webinars and these iterative releases of demonstration data. And we see that this did result in changes to the way that the Bureau implemented differential privacy in the end, specifically in the epsilon that they finally chose. Was a result of some of the concerns that were raised by interested stakeholders. However, the Bureau did not adopt all of the changes that people asked for. Some people wanted all of the data, which the Bureau was not able to do, obviously. Some people didn't want them to use differential privacy at all, which was kind of a non-starter and was something that the Bureau was not interested in changing in their process. When it comes to policy, we see how these changes allowed the balance between privacy and accuracy that has always existed in questions of disclosure avoidance in the census. We saw how that became more legible as a result of the implementation of differential privacy. And we saw how the census moved from a regime of so-called security through obscurity to something that involves more meaningful public participation. And again, we saw how stakeholder feedback did directly inform some of the policy choices, such as the epsilon in the final iteration of the system. When it comes to privacy and accuracy, there's not quite so much consensus. There, unfortunately, was a limited ability for the Bureau to actually release that much data that would allow meaningful comparison when it comes to these sorts of things. So you can imagine if we're trying to figure out what the introduction of differential privacy does to the data from 2010, what you really want to know is what the ground truth data from 2010 was, not the data that they released that had the swapping and the imputing and the rounding and the top coding, but the census can't release the ground truth data. So that kind of limited the amount of evaluation that people were capable of doing. And as such, you see kind of a wide range of evaluation where some academics think that this was basically no protection at all, and some academics think that it was actually an improvement upon prior cases. So this is kind of an active point of negotiation still. And then perhaps the most important is questions of trust. So there's been a lot of very vocal declarations of mistrust from different parties across kind of the stakeholder landscape, from demographers and voting rights advocates to tribal leadership, and that could be explained by a lot of different things. Most fundamentally, we see this being kind of an outcome of the fact that the census was able to, with differential privacy, be more transparent with the ways that they have been perturbing data in order to preserve confidentiality. But that kind of brought all of these policy choices from the backstage to the front stage in a way that kind of threatened some of the trusting relationships between different parties. And then there's also the question of politics. So you might have heard that the state of Alabama actually sued the Census Bureau in March of 2021 in a federal lawsuit alleging that they had, quote, manipulated and, quote, intentionally skewed the data. And the Bureau also became a bit of it became ammunition and other sorts of political battles around the census. As you might remember, this was the time of the citizenship question. And so the Bureau became really kind of emerged in all of these different frucases around politics at the time too. I realize I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to put all these up here. We identified a number of lessons learned, which we think are applicable to all of the governments more broadly, including just to say them, the importance of moving beyond simply identifying, characterizing, and publishing problems, the necessity of having interdisciplinary and socio-technical experts within organizations and within government, the importance of involving public throughout the entire policymaking process, not just at the end, the necessity of publishing genuine and meaningful comparison data, and then finally anticipating the vulnerability to co-optation, which was definitely a problem that the census encountered. So sorry for going a little over. Here are emails. Looking forward to discussion.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else had like a shiver go down their spine when like 2018, when 2020 census was mentioned. It's just like, oh, the flashbacks. Next, we have Alicia Boyd from New York University giving their talk, Should They? Gender Recognition, Privacy, and Accelerometers.
Thank you. Oh, getting the screen. Can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. As we're getting set up, oh, yay, it works. Oh, we will see. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Lisa, and all the other organizers for preparing this. My name is Alicia Boyd. I am a PhD. I have my PhD in computer science. I joke and I say I gaslight as a computer scientist because my educational background is actually in medicine and theoretical mathematics. And I'm the ultimate Baby Yoda stan. And a lover of almost everything sci-fi. Nevertheless, I approach scientific inquiry from a humanistic perspective, asking the questions of why and how we should we really be doing this work? And where's the power? Where are the bases, the biases and the assumptions that researchers are implementing into these different processes and workflows? So please join me on this ride because it was a ride writing this paper. Oh, we are jumping across. So here's the presentation outline where, oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah. Has a mind of its own. So here are the things that I will talk about in the presentation. Teamwork makes the dream work. So the objective of the paper, I don't know if people have read it, but to illuminate the dangers of smartphone biometrics analysis causing misconceptions due to generalization of gender norms. To give you background context, I was an AI intern and our assignment was to collect all of this accelerometer data. And the person who was over the project wanted us to use machine learning algorithms to predict gender. Based on where our cell phones were placed on our body. As I see some of the faces through the audience, it's like, ooh, this is not that great. So that is an expression that I had and thoughts asking, should we be doing this work? Next slide. Just to give a little bit background, accelerometers are in our cell phones and they measure different placements based on the movements of, they collect different data about how we walk, how we are moving. So the official definition of an accelerometer is an electromagnetic device that measures the force of acceleration caused by movement, gravity, or vibration. Accelerometers can collect subjective measurements. These raw data is about a phone's owner. This paper will focus on smartphones mainly, but in our smartwatches, Fitbits, VR headsets, they also have accelerometers as well. Part of the next step after this paper will include more smartwatches and other things that have accelerometers in them. Next slide. Also, just to let you know, accelerometers reconstruct sensitive personal data about the users. Researchers have used measurements from the raw data to give insights on how people walk, drive, how long they sit. The general purpose for accelerometers in our phones can act like pedometers, tracking movements, also measuring health and wellness, and also could be used for diagnosing of patients. So also you can use accelerometer data to understand a person's walk or gait. So in clinical spaces, say for instance, in physical therapy, gait is used to understand how one walks. Each person has a unique gait, and also shoes and footwear can impact one's gait and how we walk. So gait can change depending on how a person moves, depending on how what shoes, ground surface also can have implications on one's gait. And how the clinicians assess this is using very different tools in their space to collect using accelerometers, collecting different measurements on how to assess gait. The idea that I want to bring up is that in different spaces, people use accelerometers very differently. So computer scientists, of course, can use cell phones to gather measurements, whereas in clinical spaces like physical therapy, they have specific measurement or tools and technology to assess one's gait. Next slide. Here's a quote by Kroger, and you can read the quote. I just want to pay closer attention how they talk about accelerometers. And I highlighted some key words that these are cheap things that are invisibly embedded into our phones or the different devices. They're perfect for surveillance, not properly monitored, and it leads to our information can go to untrusted parties. Just to keep these things in mind and start to resonate, hopefully, that there are some issues and some concerns that we need to be mindful of. Next slide. So there's a gap in the the technical scholarship, the computer science scholarship, that there are some gaps in this. So for instance, when they curate data based on what someone would wear, the accelerometers may pick up something different. So clothes they're fluid, and the type of clothing that people wear are fluid. Also, the placement, they were just going by like putting your smartphone in your pocket. However, we can put it in our front pocket, back pocket, we can put it in our shirt, we can even carry it in our hands. And think about also that's a global north perspective. We have to consider global south perspectives as we're thinking about phone placement. Also, there's a lot of historical and cultural societal aspects that we're missing. Just to think about pockets and then also footwear. If you go back to the European history in Europe, back in a certain time, men would wear high heels and women wouldn't. So of course that's going to impact someone's gait. It wasn't until the French Revolution where there was a switch and altering of women wearing more high heels. Also, there's a minimal conversation about biometrics and the information that the accelerometers capture. Which leads me to this next slide. I love Jeff Goldblum, and but this quote that he has, which is part of the title of my paper, it talks about should we do this work, and this really resonates with me because we need to take a pause, like computer scientists, researchers, we need to take a pause in how we approach these things. Should we be doing this work? Who does this impact? And really take a concerted pause to really map out what are the implications in the future for this. Here are 4 key questions, again, illuminating the dangers of the data that is collected by accelerometers. How does this reinforce harms? What inferences does this make? How do we bridge the gap between the historical and cultural biases that we have, but also what's out there in society as well? The fourth question with the biometric privacy laws, that's a little bit out of my focus. However, my colleague Davi Leon, if you can wave your hand, they are a lawyer who specializes in this particular space of biometric privacy laws. Next slide. Oh yeah, no worries, no worries. So here are some insights that we bring up in the that I bring up in the paper. Gender is fluid, as well as clothing that we wear is fluid. Also, this leads to the exclusion of non-binary, trans, and non-able-bodied people. They may not, this information may not capture, or things may, scientists may not understand the nuances in people and identity as well. Also, Accelerometer has offered a way to span gate-based analysis, but does not match video recorded gate data as inaccuracy. Next slide. With the contributions, we just want to bring up the complexity and nuances that are there to really give people a pause and actually think about, should we be doing this work and what harm does this cause? Also, being mindful of what implications and impacts that this has on other people. The information presented today, also as a clarification, mostly comes from a Western perspective, gender binary, and mid to higher social economic class, and an able-bodied perspective. And next slide. I want to thank you. Happy April Fool's Day. Baby Yoda has a joke, kind of like really little different, but he always tells the truth. So thank you so much.
Mediating identity. So, it's again very commendable that I think one of the achievements of this conference in general is bringing scholars and papers together from such different disciplines, and yet really finding like common ground to begin having a broader interdisciplinary discussion. And I think that really is borne out in these papers. So to think a little bit about, I kind of, the first thing I wanted to do is just to translate mediating identities into slightly different language, to kind of, again, to articulate the commonality between these four papers. And the way I began thinking about it is how each of these think about how technology intervenes in knowing and who gets to know another person. And I think this is a little, I think it's very clear in the final three papers, but in the case study that David and Pieter offer in EdTech, I think that comes through very clearly about the role identity plays and what it means to get to know, and who gets to know becomes very clear in the case study. And what, again, I think these four papers have in common is their astute kind of methodological observation that as regimes of knowledge change, there's opportunities for the analyst to see something that when you're in a particular regime, you don't always have the access to because it becomes naturalized. And so in each of these four papers, in studying one of these kind of moments of change, really salient conclusions are drawn. So in the first paper, thinking about the transition between like Taylorism and algorithmic management, we see this kind of difference in where the conflict comes to be located. And in this case, it becomes this challenge between different expertise. In the second paper with the census, we see how when you're transitioning from one privacy regime to another, these frictions emerge in terms of what it means when you're mediating trust. And I think there's actually a lot of commonalities between that paper and Alicia's paper, in which there's the questions of what ought to remain private about identity. Again, something that's very visible when dealing with different technologies that are trying to intervene in what it means to know another. And this very much also relates to Nina's paper in terms of how these markers of identity are even formed to begin with. So having this example of not taking for granted even what an identity means in terms of, therefore, what is the even baseline upon which you build your knowledge claims. Those also have moments of emergence. So those are kind of the commonalities I see between these papers. Again, that technologies intervene in how we know each other, and as regimes shift, we have opportunities to really dig deep into some of the logics of these interventions and what we take for granted. So just to pose a couple questions that either the panel can take, or we can move on to audience questions. The first is, how do we navigate such regime changes responsibly? Right? If these are inevitable to some extent, how do we think about the best way to preserve our understandings of identity as kind of modes of knowledge shift? And I think this actually brings back some of the questions from the previous panel in terms of, do we need, these regime changes, right? Is it worth it, as Valère kind of brought up, or should they, as Ian Malcolm is constantly advising us, who decides if these regime changes even ought to happen in the first place, and why? And then kind of secondly, how does one really protect marginalized identities during these moments of transition? This is certainly the concern when thinking about the census, as well as like lessons from the gait and facial analyses. And I think I would be actually really curious to think if that question of marginalized identities comes to matter in the case study of EdTech in David and Pieter's paper either. So I think I wanted to open up with very kind of high level questions. How do we do these responsibly? How do we really think about marginalized identities within our these kind of topics and ideas? But certainly also open to any kind of comments that any of you might have had in terms of hearing each other's papers, and of course, to the audience as well. So I don't know, off we go.
Thank you for the really, really great questions. I find them very hard to answer. How do we navigate this change responsibly? I think for sociologists, this question is really important. Because we have a peculiar position. Sorry, yeah, I'll speak a bit closer to the microphone. I think as sociologists, we have a very peculiar position, which is maybe different than those of the experts that we study, which is the pedagogists and the teachers. That is, as sociologists, we're not necessarily bound by the same problems. Sociologists usually study fields, but not necessarily are bound by the same problems of that field. And so it's very hard to draw the line between who has a right to speak in this matter. And I think that as a sociologist, this question becomes even more important. We cannot necessarily hide behind the question, is this detrimental to education, for example? And so for us, the whole format of our paper tries to reflect this balancing act between showing what is at stake, but at the same time, not necessarily denigrating the claims of each of the two parties. And maybe that is a way to responsibly deal with this change.
I'll say a little more. Yeah. Directly to your question, Lisa. So the teacher says, I know the child. And the learning engineer says, I don't know the child. I don't want to know the child. I don't want to know the whole child. I have a very different kind of knowledge. And they say, we don't make any claim to know the whole child. In fact, they actually say that's not a good thing to know the whole child, because it brings in all kinds of stuff about the background of the child, their race, their gender, their socioeconomic status, and all this kind of stuff. So there's who knows and who can know and what can be known are very much at issue. About identity, not so much in our paper, but I think in general terms, you ask, how to preserve our understanding of identity as modes of knowledge shift. Another way to think about the problem is, how do changes in modes of, as you say, as modes of knowledge shift? Yes. So how do changes in modes of knowledge yield changes in what it means to have identity? So I think there's really something interesting happening about identities. The more people have different profiles on all kinds of different aspects of social media and the like, the more many people have persona, like not just people who write or actors or sports athletes. Lots of people have personas, and the relationship between those persona and their identity is something that maybe had been encountered by people previously, but we might think about it as a new kind of moment in what it means to have an identity. Even notions like authenticity can be, we say, well, yeah, authenticity, that's the most important thing that happens. I don't know that actually that young people are so preoccupied with the notion of the authentic self. I think they may have some kind of wondering, like, what would that mean anyway? I don't know exactly, but I think there's interesting things happening with the very meaning of identity now.
So in response to like responsibility, one of my approaches in my work is to really start with the computer scientists, starting to ask them questions about what their assumptions are when they do this work. Are there methods or different frameworks that we can help guide computer scientists or software engineers through this process as they develop AI technologies as a way to mitigate it on the back end? Not saying that it's foolproof, but at least we start somewhere to assess what are we doing, why are we doing it? And it starts with these very basic questions at the front end, at the back end, but going through the process. And hopefully it starts a little bit of a conversation about how can we stop these harms or prevent these harms that will have impacts on communities, especially marginalized communities located on the fringes.
Yeah, thanks for the really great questions. I will say, I commend you on finding commonalities across the papers, because when I looked at them, I was like, wow, I feel like these are really wide ranging, but that's correct. These are the commonalities across them. I think as to the question, I mean, they're related. The question of how to protect marginalized identities during these moments of transition, and thus how to navigate regime changes responsibly. I hesitate to even say this because at this point, it feels perhaps so obvious that everyone in the room knows, but of course it bears repeating that I think part of the answer is just to ensure that those who are marginalized are involved in the transition and are empowered to either be decision makers or at the very least have access to people who are making decisions in these sorts of contexts. So I think the example of tribal leadership in the kind of controversy around DP and the census is a good example. So when it comes to differential privacy, the effects that the noise adds to the data set are greater at small scales. So at the scale of state populations, DP doesn't really change things very much, but at the scale of small communities, you can see really wide shifts as a result of the noise that is added. And this is really a concern for Native American tribes in the US because they actually did a report where they had an independent researcher look at what the addition of differential privacy would do to Native American communities as reported in 2010. And they had a table reporting the number of Native American lands, tribal lands that would have been reduced by 100%. Like there was greater than one. There were like sometimes dozens of lands that had population reported in 2010 that if differential privacy had been applied in 2010 in these early, prototype versions of the algorithm would have completely not been reported. And by having consultations with tribal leaders, the census was able to identify that problem and they iterated a bit. I think if you talk to the tribal leaders themselves, they're still posted public letters criticizing some aspects of the Bureau, but there were things that the Bureau did to kind of mitigate those concerns. And that wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't have been involved in the process and been given a voice and been empowered to influence the direction that the algorithm ended up going. So I think bears repeating.
Okay. I'm always a little bit hesitant on questions of, how should we be doing things? I just really belong to the branch of academia that raises a lot of critique and no solutions. So, I'm really grateful to lawyers and people that work in policy who actually influence change and not just, whine. But that being said, I think in doing the research for this part of my project, I maybe can speak about the opposition from Chinese elites and how maybe that offers some lessons for acting responsibly during this era. They had somewhat limited power, right? So they're able to roll back the identity regime a little bit, but they still land on the photo. And there's ways that you can critique the amount of relative power they have as opposed to Chinese laborers who were, absolutely, it was impossible for them to really contest this form of identity. But I think if we maybe take the lesson and think generously about it, there are probably people in this room who are relatively elites in relation to like the rest of their community, right? And so thinking about how using that sort of privilege and power to speak back to the beginnings of things that we see brewing, I think that's probably what we're already all thinking about if we are at this conference. So I think we're on the right track.
Thank you. I asked the question without obviously having myself an answer. Let's go to audience questions. How about, whoever. Sure. You can hear me? No? Yes? Great. So I was really struck by the commonalities about the sort of getting at identity view, sort of physical measurement. Oh, is it not?
No, it was on before.
Great. I'll talk closer. Yeah, it was too much beckoning. So I guess I was interested in, so I loved the question about sort of doing it responsibly, but I was also, as I was listening to this, thinking about sort of like basically the history of objectivity, where sort of like we see sort of where the subjective judgment gets shifted along the way. And so I think that was super clear with the Chinese exclusion example, but I think also as we see from like teachers, just don't like the student, or that now becoming like the student who's like learning in the wrong way, or the face that's, presenting myself in a photo a certain way, or my watch that like tells me how I need to like look at my watch in order to sort of have that normalized movement. And so I guess I was partly just thinking about, and I think I'm using this phrase around the bureaucratic positivism, but it kind of seems like that control of identity and normalization is the point and not the, like an unintended consequence. And so it sounded like all of these projects were kind of highlighting ways in which that was happening. And so I haven't quite sort of found the question in that yet, but I guess I'm wondering how you're reckoning with the sort of normalizing aspects as the, again, the source of control rather than something we couldn't have seen coming, I guess. I will just go ahead and try to repeat it. I think it's because of the placement. It was a little hard to, so if I get your question wrong, please correct it. So, this is coming from I think this is it, the question was kind of is it a feature or a bug, you know, or is the bug the feature, right? And so in thinking about how objectivity is a historical phenomenon, not something that simply exists in the world, but something that gets created in particular social, political, and temporal contexts, the question I think that you were trying to pose is, when you've encountered in your case studies instances in which certain modes of identity are being normalized, is that, to what extent do you detect that that is intentional by the bureaucratic systems that are putting these in place? And when might some of the normalization processes be unintentional? Really, so trying to pick apart when normalizing aspects of identity are being done by the systems of power you're studying as intentional versus when you think that they're actually more legitimately unintentional consequences of the larger structures.
That's a great question. One of the respondents I spoke with was a teacher and gave the example of the use of iPads in the class, attesting to her difficulty to teach 30, 12-year-olds, which is already quite something, but then to do so with each an iPad and games on it. And so I think the question is not so much that they are prescribing behavior as if they are literally disrupting, changing what the correct behavior actually is. And it is probably, but there's certainly not an intended effect, but it's happening. That the normal expertise of the teacher is actually stands sometimes in the way of the expertise of the other.
Some more. So the learning engineer would accuse the educators of the ones who are the normalizing. Okay, you know, school, that's about normality. You know, we know that one. And what you do is, well, we predict the next answer to the next question, but you prepare students for the world. The teachers say, we prepare students for the world. And that the learning engineer says, yeah, you're preparing them for this world in which people succeed and fail. And you're teaching to the normal, and you have special programs for the gifted and the problematic. So again, do I believe these claims? But these are the claims that are made. I say, you are the ones who are normalizing. Actually, we don't do that. If our things work right, every student succeeds or fails at the same rate in any given question, because we are able to match the level of capability of the student to the level of difficulty of this question. If we do it right, 80% of the chance, 80% of the time, the student should be able to give a correct answer. So you are the ones who normalize because you are a system that's built around success and failure. And that's not what we're about. So it's an interesting kind of world in which you have people making such claims about who's normalizing and who's not normalizing. Yeah.
No, thank you for that question. It's making me think how we approach different processes. And in the case of the accelerometers, it was a question that was posed to us. So we were collecting the data and then implementing the processes. And I think this was said yesterday during one of the panels. We had magnitudes of data that represent multiple identities and lived experiences, but we want to just dwindle it down to this one single thing. And you're getting rid of the intricacies, the complexities, and all these different things just into a binary component that we somewhat get, maybe. What the question that I pose that I rack with my, like, I deal with it with myself, whether it's professional or personal, how can we keep the complexity? We're not really taught to deal with the complexity of just life in general. Now we're bringing this ooh, I don't want to deal with complexity within this technological space, but we're not like, as I'm sitting here, I'm also nervous, but happy and scared. All these different emotions, you know, interact with everything. I can dwindle it down to one, but it doesn't explain everything else. So how do we begin to teach engineers like, hey, do we have to be creative in finding different methodologies and tools that support complexity and not dwindle it down? What does that look like? Are we able to experiment and try? Like, what does that look like? And that's some of the stuff that I try to do in my work, as far as let's sit with this grayness and let's work through this process of still maintaining the complexity, so we will not eliminate different nuances and things that, you know, could help in the through the process later on. And it's a huge task. The challenge is, can we stay in that uncomfortableness as we're going through that process? And that's a good question to think about.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful panel and also discussion. I had more remarks listening to your answers. For you directly to this question of complexity, we had a similar case in our paper working on DNA testing and the production of ethnicities, and where complexity is in the data, but it gets systematically excluded to produce identities that are legible. And so it's very interesting to see, for me, as you say, that the data is gray, is complex, but with this complexity is not actionable. What do you do with the complexity? And so it seems like we always come back to eliminating it while it is actually there, because what can you do with it? What product can you sell if people are so multifaceted, for instance? So I really think it's an important point. I'm just wondering how will it land for engineering that are trying to create products more than knowledge, maybe. That would be one question to you. To you, David, you said that you're not sure that authenticity is still a claim, and I don't, or a need, and I'm sometimes wondering if on the contrary, the more technological mediation of identity production, the more there is a need to claim an authenticity in order to be recognized instead of misrecognized. Because as you also showed, all these technologies are technology of misrecognition. So that would be a point also for your paper. I was wondering, an element that didn't appear was the question of it goes from the presupposition that the student wants to learn, the machine, the technological processing of learning. And I think as a teacher, you are faced by the issues, does the student want to learn? And how do you bring the student to the point, yeah, it's great to have machines, but how do you bring student to the point of wanting to learn, to engage first with what is the offer? And so there, I think that the technology comes a little bit short, and the teacher are still needed to find that middle ground where there is a desire. How do you elicit a desire to learn? And last point, I'm sorry, I'm talking so long. We tried with Alex in our paper to distinguish between two modes of identity production, rule-based bureaucratic one, and machine learning, I would say technological one. And I think, Nina, that your example, your case study showed that the two of them like are in, there are intricacies and are entangled. And so it complexified kind of this opposition that we tried to build based on DNA testing, for instance. So thank you so much. It was super inspiring.
What is complexity? What does it look like? It looks differently on the situation and context, and it's not one size fits all. And it leads us again into that ambiguity, that uncomfortableness, especially if we have deliverables and objectives that we need to meet. It puts more pressure on trying to figure out, and then we have to default to, okay, this works, so let's go ahead and do it. It's a challenge because also too, I was not trained to think in the complexities of that. That's like, and even in the medical field in which I was trained in the computer science field, I was not trained, hey, let's look at differences and everything. It came by experience, knowing that, hey, if someone had diabetes, how they got to have the diagnosis of diabetes very differently. And it came with their own lived experience. And holding on to that, that was my grounding to navigate these different spaces of what to solutions that could work for them. And yeah, it's time consuming, it's a lot of work, but it helped with adherence and the patient seeing, you know, knowing like, oh my goodness, you see me, you're taking time. And that's like the, you know, feel good benefit. But to do that with technology, it's a lot of hard work. I would still encourage and have conversations like we're doing right now in this space, like how do we deal with this, and try to make strides, because knowing that these harms are out there and it's hurting different communities, especially on the fringes, because the main space doesn't feel it yet. We still need to, you know, make strides to have these conversations and try to come up with various solutions. So thank you.
I know it was a bit more of comments towards David and Nina, but I don't know if either of you would like to respond. And then we do have another question from the audience.
Are you ready?
I just want to see if either of them have a response. Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I first had a brief comment and then a question, that this issue that David, you just brought up about the personalized education versus kind of a generalized normalizing approach shows up in a lot of places, and a lot of tension. We have personalized medicine targeted for the patient. We have personalized credit ratings versus bureaucratic credit ratings and so on. So that tension, I think, is part of a number of the issues we're talking about. And if some of you could address how you see that in the areas you've looked at, that would be great. Another part of this also is the complexity issue that just came up. Not only do we have more complexity in the data, we have more complexity not in the data, because it's just not being collected. I don't want to advocate that we should collect even more data. You're always going to lose something. But in terms of the, how do we approach this? How do you teach engineers? How do you talk about these kinds of issues? Models always include and exclude. And I'm wondering if there's a way to help people understand that what's excluded from the model is also could be very important. And you have to think about what kind of modeling you're using and what's in and what's out, and how you might address that, both educationally and socially and so on. Because each one of you talked some about ways that that happens. And that's been also a theme in this conference, about some of the issues of modeling. So I'm curious about how it relates to the kinds of issues that you've been dealing with, the kinds of case studies that you've done, and so on.
Thanks. I feel like many of you would have something to say on that topic. Lauren, I'm wondering if, I mean, given that you are the most kind of this with the census, it's kind of the most explicit in terms of deciding what is included and what is excluded. So I was curious if maybe you might have something you might want to say there.
Yeah, I've been sitting here trying to think through what I think. I think that in some ways, this example of the census implementing DP is kind of a counterexample to what we typically encounter when we talk about complexity. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was screaming. Okay, I'll talk louder. I was just saying, I feel like in some ways, this example of the census trying to implement this DP algorithm into their disclosure avoidance system is a counterexample to what we often talk about in terms of algorithms and social complexity. Though I'm not convinced if I actually think that, so let's talk through it and let me know if you disagree. But I feel like oftentimes we're talking about, for instance, in the case of gait recognition with accelerometers, trying to take an extremely complex, diverse, multivariate data set and condense it down to perhaps even a binary. But in the context of, and this is true in the context of the census, where the census, obviously we have the whole country and we have all the things the whole country is, and then someone has to decide the questions that we ask to get put on the form. So there is a collapse of complexity into simplicity. But I think in the specific case of how to implement differential privacy as a protection mechanism, what they're actually trying to do is optimize complexity under the constraint of privacy, where it's not the prerogative of those scientists who are trying to fine-tune the algorithm to decide to take off a question or add a question. The questions have already been set. They're trying to take the data and maintain its accuracy and its usability while kind of implementing stronger privacy constraints. I don't know what that means. I just think it's perhaps interesting in that, I'm repeating myself, but I feel like often in context of algorithms, we aren't optimizing for complexity. We're trying to compress it into smaller dimensions. I don't know if that answers any of the questions, but it's a thought.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on the question just asked or the observations posed?
I have a collection of thoughts that's not speaking to any one question, but I think is bringing together some of the larger conversations that we're having about identity. I mean, I really see this, and I agree that this is one of the central problems of kind of our era, right? We have what's sometimes called pejoratively identity politics, but especially among young people, really believing that, you know, identity is something that's formed internally. It's based on your own lived experiences of the world. It's something that can be malleable. So this idea of the one singular authentic identity is less important, although I do think that they think about authenticity in different ways. And this is almost as if it's completely counterintuitive to the external idea from bureaucratic or algorithmic systems that try to assign an identity onto you, right? And so there's going to be this tension between identity as something that can only be formed internally, and then how does that get leave traces that then can be detectable by external systems. So in the case of the gait recognition, the idea, this is, I mean, I completely agree with you that these systems are like unnecessary and they're always going to result in erroneous predictions. But there's something really interesting about their theory of gender there, which is all about performance, right? So like they conflate gender with the clothes you wear and the shoes you wear, which is very different than the types of gender detection algorithms that facial recognition tries to do, which is like trying to uncover trans people or like seek some like deeper real biological truth. So in some ways they're actually offering a different theory of gender there. But we're always getting this clash between the objective of pooling identity or trying to take it from your exterior, and then the increasing observation or belief, especially among young people, that identity is something that is formed only internally. So identity, subjectivity, authenticity, I think these questions keep coming up in all of our, and I see your paper about being professional identity, right? Like we see these different things really shaping people's. I think that the way that you posed these almost hyper stylized voices makes that professional identity clear, right?
Can I respond to that? So, this is not actually in our paper, but it's another one. So Katya, Giovanni Formalon and I have a paper in Theory and Society, and it's based on a study of 35 new electronic music artists, most of them in Berlin, some of them in Brooklyn. Okay. And none of them had fewer than 3 aliases. Some of them had as many as 12. And these are fluid, and some of them they choose, they fall out, they pick it back up, and all these kinds of things. So identity is in the relationship between person and persona. So I'll come back to that because I think it directly now. I can make a connection here. So there was an era, the romantic one, in which people would have said, I mean, do you really think that sincerity is over? I mean, the regime of sincerity is you needed to get your inner self to correspond to your external role. I say, and now you want that it should be my role should somehow be an expression of my true and inner self. Right? Okay, so if we say the end of authenticity, why not? I mean, maybe it's not going to happen, but the idea that you would have a big change from sincerity to authenticity already happened. Like maybe there's a next one that's coming up. We don't know. So I'm not sure that even certainly for these electronic music artists, okay, but for the ordinary, I don't know, 22-year-old, is identity really, do they have some idea that there's this authentic inner self? I don't think it's only sociologists who have an idea that identity is somehow relational.
Oh, no, I agree.
That
Yeah.
it's relational. And you just, as you said, the shoes, okay, like we try out identities. We have things we try on. You know, these are trials, these are tests. We put them out in the world. We kind of have them on, we see, do they fit? Maybe they don't fit. Maybe they don't fit. Oh, that's good, because that means I can be something other than I thought I was. So I think identity is really much more relational, and that people actually experience it that way. And to sort of have like identity is this thing which is fixed and we know it and it's categorical and it's, you know, true. I don't think that everybody does that.
No,
Yeah.
well,
yeah.
I want to clarify, when I say I think they think about authenticity in another way, it's not, I am in complete agreement, both
Yeah.
personally and also what I think young people are thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
The idea about authenticity is I just think there's still a little bit of essentialism sometimes. So one of my students told me recently, there's a trend on TikTok where if someone claims a racial identity, they'll be like, post a photo of your parents. And what they are concerned about people, there's some limitation, I guess, to the limitless trying on of identities. So there is some concerns about authenticity there, but certainly not about like, you can only have one. And I think that a mixed race person, you know, changing their conception of what their racial identity is over time would be completely valid and different than someone who's posing as a completely different race than the one that they were born.
One point I really appreciated in the previous panel was how all of the papers were dealing with kind of, we as humans kind of can't ever know the future. And yet we seek ways of comforting ourselves that we possibly can. And I feel like that's where we've ended this discussion on as well. We can't possibly know even our own identities, let alone another one's self. And yet we keep on creating these regimes and strategies for comforting ourselves that maybe we can not only know someone else, but also know ourselves. So in all of these kind of papers, at least of today, that kind of ambiguity is central, and these technological apparatuses emerge to give us comfort in that which we can never know. So I'm going to take that moment to end the panel and hand it back over to Aaron.
Okay, So I am going to make just a few incredibly brief remarks because I just don't want to talk a lot at all. So I'm going to share this slide, which hopefully will work. It says I'm screen sharing, so I guess it's working. And then function F5. Nope. What if I just do it this way? No. It's funny because this laptop, of course, has like a weird function key. Let's see. F5. Nope. All right. Well, I'm gonna admit a person. Well, I'm gonna just zoom this in. This is an appropriate way to end a conference about quantification and data. With some hijinks. All right. Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Share full screen. You know, I've been doing this all weekend, right? So you would think at this point I would just be a master at this, but alas. Does anyone who actually uses PowerPoint all the time, since I never do, know how to do this? Hit what? Yes.
To the right, right.
To the right. More right. Slideshow. Oh yeah, slideshow from the beginning. Woo! See, as a team, we can do it. Which is great actually, because that's what I want to say right now. There we go. So I want to thank everyone who shared their work with us, their ideas with us, their time with us, their energy, their attention. Conferences do not occur through the work of one person or even of several people. They occur through, they're made possible by the generosity of communities. And these people here have been enormously helpful in making this conference go off without, but I think I can say safely now, without a hitch. I hope there was no colossal disaster. I feel like we did okay. And that really is made possible by so many people that you never see. And so here are some of the names of very important contributors to this conference. And if we just would take a moment to give a hand to all of these people. Okay, so I just to speak for myself, when I was thinking about making this conference and in conversation with other people here at the ISP about what this conference might be, I find myself going back to you know, sort of the premise of the fundamental question of this conference as I see it, which is how quantification practices inform and reshape our values and our communities, right? Not just how we understand our communities, but what we even understand communities to be, right? And in turn, how we understand ourselves in relationship to those communities, right? It's how we imagine our futures. It's how we imagine our pasts. It's how we imagine making things better or worse. What we choose to measure profoundly influences the kinds of solutions we think to enact. I'm thinking of my spouse, who's a health policy researcher, who hears all the time people who want to use practices of quantification, for instance, what they say on Facebook or what they say on Twitter, to try to identify suicide risk, right? Something that seems very important, right? And at the same time, I think about how these practices of quantification, in trying to do something good, so often do something terrible. And we've seen lots of examples in the panels of the past 2 days of all kinds of things that can happen out of the best of intentions, but actually end up producing all kinds of terrible results. So in some sense, I don't want to resolve that tension. I think it would be foolish in a context like this, in closing remarks, to even pretend that that's something that I can do. But I do want to leave the conversation. I want to end the conference with that tension in mind, in the hopes that as a community here, and as we go out into the world, we can continue to have those conversations about the tensions that quantification produce, and about the kinds of communities we want to exist in the world. So with that, thank you so much again for all of your attention and help. It's been a joy to hear all of these talks, and I wish you safe travels wherever your home may be. Thank you.